you ready for the incredible sound of classic rock? No? Good, because now it's time for Visiting the Village.
Welcome to Visiting the Village. I'm Paul Kilduff-Taylor, and with me as ever is the informative Ian Hardingham.
Hello, Mr. Paul Kilduff-Taylor. I've been turned on every year for my life, and my saves haven't disrupted yet. Maybe they will soon.
Let's get out of this dungeon.
It's the top story.
Did the Sony Vita fail because the mobile gaming market was stolen by smartphones and tablets, or was it because Sony almost entirely neglected it? An article from Kotaku alleges the latter and outlines a number of reasons why they believe the console was not a success. Ian Hardingham, is the Vita a failure, and if so, why?
I actually find this a really difficult question to answer. I've had this conversation with lots of different people, and people's general preconception is that the Vita is a failure, and in a lot of ways it's hard to argue with it. Having said that, it's one of my favourite consoles of all time. It's something that I take with me whenever I go somewhere where I may be bored and waiting for a while. It's got a couple of games, specifically Spelunky and Terraria, which I never thought would be in a playable form on a mobile console, and sort of stand out to me as two of the greatest mobile games of all time. And especially Terraria is a game that really had no business being anywhere near a handheld console. And the fact that it ended up on the Vita is excellent. So I think it's a really tough question. And I really don't think you'd get much sort of agreement within Sony even if they were put on a lie detector test and told to tell the absolute truth. Because Sony have a very unusual way of dealing with technology like this. They've leveraged the Vita in lots of different ways. They've used it as a side companion thing to the PS4. It's part of their kind of weird brand. It's a very high gloss, luxurious product. So the answer to that question is I don't really know.
I think you have to say that the Vita is a commercial failure. I can't really imagine any way in which that statement isn't factually true. The last sort of unit total was around 12 million, and that compares to 80 million for the PSP. It's really far down there in the sort of all-time console sales charts. So I think on that metric alone, especially given that the way it was pitched initially was as this kind of AAA handheld, I think they would have expected it and needed it to do a lot more than that for it to be an unambiguous success in those terms. However, as you say, Sony are very good at, once a technology is out there, they try and position it in the best way they can, and they try new things with it. They don't just accept that something isn't working and kill it off. Although people have accused them of doing that with the Vita, I don't think that's actually been what's happened. They've tried to find things that the Vita is good at doing, and they've tried to do a lot of those things, which is very admirable. And also, it certainly helps with their brand in the eyes of people who buy games. If there is this cool niche handheld, which is what the Vita is, then that's got to be a good thing. As long as they're not, constantly losing huge amounts of money on it, which I doubt they are, then it's got to be a good thing.
Yeah, 12 million units is pretty bad, actually. That's worse than I thought. So I agree with you on all of that. I think that the people who want to say that Sony killed the Vita, they always talk about where are the games and what they mean by that, because the Vita's got a very good catalogue. A lot of games that are on other platforms, but in terms of which games you can play on the Vita, it's a pretty amazing catalogue. The thing that they mean when they say that is that they want a load of great first-party titles for it. And that's just not what Sony does anymore. They don't really have much first-party stuff on the PS4 either. A lot of the big games on there are big-budget titles from third parties, and of course they're not going to spend that much money on the Vita. I mean, I also wish that there was a company that made as amazing games as Nintendo, making games for every single platform. That would be amazing, but that's just not the way it is. You can't make that many great first-party games. And I was kind of at peace with that long before the Vita came out. So for me, the fact that they basically just port a load of great games onto the Vita so I can play it in a really comfortable way is kind of an ideal situation. I just think it's basically an inappropriate criticism to start talking about how Sony should have spent a bunch of money on a load of first-party titles for it. That just doesn't make sense in this day and age.
Yeah, I agree. And also the first-party titles, for us are not going to be the things that we're interested in. It's just a very, very good console for a specific niche of people, and I hope that there is also no reason why it can't continue to exist. It's certainly powerful enough to run a lot of interesting things. A lot of these kind of more interesting, obscure indie titles will still be able to run on the Vita for quite a long time in the future. It would be nice if it was slightly easier to develop for, though I guess with Unity and so on that's kind of improved enormously in the Vita's life cycle. So what I would hope for the Vita is that it just continues to stick around and it continues to have this ongoing role, because I think there will always be a powerful niche interest in a handheld console which has real controls that you can use to play a greater range of games than a mobile device. And while its hardware is still relevant, I think the Vita could kind of have its something of a second life in that way. It's not going to be the PSP, it's not going to do that now, I think that's very clear, but it might carve out its own thing.
Yeah, I mean, the ideal situation would be if someone could make a handheld that's as nice and ergonomic as the Vita is, that can run PC games. But that's not going to happen for a very long time. PC games themselves are really badly optimized in general. They want to take advantage of the power they have access to, and that is, really generally a lot more power than you could pack in something that size. So it's going to be something that has to have stuff ported to it. And the Vita has a critical mass, and it has some support from PS Plus and still some support from Sony to make that happen. And as you say, Unity is going to make that a lot easier. I think in a lot of ways, the Vita doing as well as it has done in terms of its catalogue, its indie games catalogue, is a real sign of the times. And I almost think now is one of the only times that could have happened. In the future, if everything is using an engine such as Unity, it might be a moot point. But a lot of these games that had a lot of money and work put into porting them, stuff like Terraria, even Thomas Was Alone, had quite a lot of money spent on developing those games. That all just came for sort of some weird conglomeration of the stars that happened at this period of time. I want to address, as we leave this topic, a couple of the hot takes that Kotaku have about what caused Vita to die and how it's Sony's fault. Their first point is that they charged a huge amount for the memory cards for the Vita and forced you to use their own ones and not allow you to use off-the-shelf ones. Look, that's really annoying and that's really bad. And that's the kind of thing that Sony does. It allows them to charge less on the console itself. It's a bit of a tricky thing to do, but it's quite a normal thing to do. And I can't believe for a second that would have a significant impact on the success of the console overall. In terms of them deciding not to show the Vita on their big shows in the last couple of years, as a Vita fan, it's really annoying, but I can totally understand it. They need to put as much power behind the PS4 as they possibly can to keep their leading position and hopefully be in the position that they can keep putting some money into the Vita.
I think that's all fine. I mean, yeah, it's something that they've been doing more recently is having these little sidebars of Vita games, and that's great because that keeps the Vita fans happy, and it means they don't have to use up that really valuable real estate on the Vita, as you say. That's not sensible, so there's no good reason for them to do that. I like the little mini montages of all these cool games coming out on the Vita. That's the kind of thing Vita fans like. I'm still an enormous Vita fan, as are you, and a lot of people are. If you think about those 12 million units, that's still a very, significant market size for someone making an indie game. So if the ecosystem is really based around that, it's based around selecting for basically quite a core of players, a niche of players, and then that's something that's really nice to have addressable. And as the games industry kind of continues to separate out into these wider niches, that could be something really good. So I think it's time for a bit more of a rehabilitation of the Vita in the press. Like, we all understand now, nobody's going to argue that it's a big commercial success, but let's start looking at the ways in which it's good and the ways in which Sony are doing good things with it.
Yes.
Yes. AI researcher Michael Cook has written about the current state of procedurally generated games. For him, it means more unpredictable stuff. More meaning that new things can always be generated, unpredictable meaning that a player can't tell what's going to come next, and stuff meaning that it doesn't really matter what is being generated. Ian Hardingham, how do you feel about this take on procedural generation?
Well, I'm not sure about the précis here, but in terms of the actual article, I really agreed with it a lot. And not only because it talked about I'm going to forget the name of the golf game that I absolutely love. Desert Golfing. My apologies. It's been a very long day. Desert Golfing, one of my favourite generative games of all time. And he starts off the article talking about how he wasn't sure for a very long time to what extent the Desert Golf levels were generated. And I was exactly the same. I really had exactly the same response to him, which is that they kind of look like they could both be completely randomly generated, or they could also be completely designed. It's just a really bizarre thing. I mean, the game's amazing. If you haven't played it, you need to. It's kind of a really, really, really interesting game. And also, he talks about a little vignette about how he explained to someone that talking to them about the cactus on level 54 would be a spoiler. And I felt exactly the same way, and you'll know what I mean if you play it. So basically, the core of what he's talking about here, I think, is that he looks at No Man's Sky and talks about how it'll have 48 trillion planets or whatever. But that will sort of become... The marginal value of each new planet will sort of tend to zero, because the human brain will work out that they're all coming from the same kind of generator, and even though they will be technically unique, they will just feel like this massive mush. And I think what he's trying to get at is that where procedural generation really works is when it's actually making stuff which is genuinely new and relevant for each level. And I think that's something that definitely needs to be explored.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about this a fair amount. I mean, generation is one of those things where I feel like it's interesting hearing you talk about Desert Golfing. I feel like sometimes generation matters more to designers and people who think about design than it does to players. Like, you often say that you feel that things are too linear. And Desert Golfing, for me, aka The Emperor's New Golfing, is one of those games where people are just absolutely obsessed with its methodology, but not actually with what it is, which is quite a boring golf game. And I think procedural generation is quite a lot like that. It's about this idea, this feeling of creating this sort of unpredictable space in some ways that is going to promise all of these things. But ultimately, what it boils down to in a lot of cases is this sort of slight design fetishism around this thing of automatically generated stuff. Well,
there's a lot to unpack there, but let's first talk about you saying that Desert Golfing is a boring golf game. I think it's a truly great casual game. It might be a lacking actual golf game when compared to how many different clubs you can have in Mario Golf. But I think it's certainly one of the most compelling actual games I've played of that size. I think that designers do tend to get massively obsessed with generative content. It allows us to basically program little workers to make all the content rather than having to get artists to do it or level designers to do it. And that's really exciting. And programmers tend to like making systems anyway, so making systems that make the game for you is really exciting. I do think that we're kind of moving through that a little bit, though, to start actually examining, as we are here, what is good about generative creation, because we're starting to see a lot of bad generative creation. And we're going to be talking that a bit later on with the new Descent clone that's coming out. So for me, I'm still kind of developing my opinion as a player, and I think one of the reasons that Spelunky is always held up as one of the greats with generative content is that it's not just creating an environment, like a context for your play, but it's actually genuinely creating puzzles Spelunky is kind of a puzzle platformer in some ways, trying to work out how to get to somewhere else with using the minimum number of resources. And the generator is incredibly good at producing new puzzles. And that's why I think Desert Golfing works so well, because it's kind of a puzzle. And you can see, I think, clearly how that goes up against what something like No Man's Sky or maybe Elite, when you can land on the planets, when there's so much, it's about making content, it's about stuff to fill in the world around you, to create this atmospheric feeling. And I think that that's a really different thing.
That's a very good distinction, actually, between content, which is sort of fluff, and gameplay. Specifically puzzles in the instance of Spelunky, or I suppose if you look at something like The Swindle, there's definitely a puzzle element there, but it's more of a kind of overarching level design. And in Isaac, it's different. Again, that's much more about item placement, combinations, and things, about the sort of gambling metagame, really, of Isaac, about those longer form decisions. So random generation, I think, as I guess you do, can work really well when it's about having this impact on structure that linear design can't have. But it works less well when it's about trying to make the world sort of feel more interesting or have more context, perhaps.
Right. Exactly. As a player, most often when I play a game and I say, I wish this was a randomly generated game rather than a fully designed game, it usually means that I want the skills that I'm learning to be more widely applicable, and I want to have sort of more interesting stuff quicker. And also, it might be that the game isn't working for me as just a linear progression, so I want to be able to restart it and have something new when I'm restarting it. So, in a lot of ways, just generative content on its own is not the only answer, which again is what we're kind of seeing now with some games coming out where people are really criticising the levels that are being randomly generated as being really boring. And again, as we're going to talk about a bit later, the genre that's having the most problem with this is the first-person shooter. I've played a couple of generative first-person shooter games. I've been thinking for a while that it's going to be the next big thing. It's going to be a big game, I think, in the next year, which is a generative first-person shooter. I think a really big hit.
That's a call.
What was that? Sorry.
That's a call.
Yeah, that's a call. That's my call. Yeah, and I think that people are so far struggling more than I thought with making a generator for first-person shooter levels or 3D environments that produces the kind of thing that it should be. And I think that's because I wasn't giving enough respect to how hard it is to actually design these levels. And I don't think I and a lot of the people actually understand what's going on with these environments that you can explore. And it's so much easier to see the interaction between mechanics and aesthetic in a 2D game than it is in a 3D game, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a really interesting video of John Romero playing through Doom with a journalist, and they play the first level, and he says some stuff about how if you're making one of those games in those eras, what they always did was they made the first level last. So when you know everything there is to know about level design, which is a process that you go through learning on making the game, then you know how to show off what is interesting about the game and how to craft something that's fun and, sort of slightly teaches the game for the first level. So I think there's a lot of human creativity that goes into the flow, even just the geometry of those first-person shooter levels. And we're going to come on to talk about that more a bit later when we talk about Sub-Level Zero. I think just to finish this off, there's definitely this procedural generation has been kind of the buzzword, perhaps tied up with the roguelike thing of the last few years. As everyone knows, I've been playing a lot of Prison Architect, and that's really interesting because it's about a human design system designed by the player interacting with a load of random events and sort of randomly generated prisoners that come in. So there's this thing about this balance of control and randomness in a game that can be immensely compelling. And I think the thing that needs to happen is people need to stop looking to this as the be-all and end-all. We're seeing the big procedural generated games now, No Man's Sky being the headliner of those, and we're going to see the limits of that very quickly, I think.
Yeah, I agree with all of that.
In a piece for Paste, Omar Alaza has written about the colonialist overtones of Metal Gear Solid 5, specifically about how acquiring new soldiers by kidnapping them reduces what is ostensibly a human being to a resource. He believes that this is compounded by the way the game ranks soldiers and by its appropriation of settings with real-world colonial history. Ian Hardingham, do games need to be more culturally aware when they use this kind of setting?
I don't know. I'm having difficulty putting these two things together. So, I can understand in abstract the point that Metal Gear Solid sort of somehow cheapens human lives to resources. That's definitely true. It's something that happens in an awful lot of games. It's definitely true. So I can understand that point. And then I can also understand the point that these places where Metal Gear Solid is set have a history of colonialism, I guess. It's the combination that I find a little bit difficult to work out, because it seems that sort of it's such a global thing against humanity, I guess, to reduce humans in games to resources. It doesn't feel like it's specific to a particular location. Like, that would be okay if that was going on in Southern America or something, but not okay in some other place. That doesn't make any sense to me.
Well, he's saying it would be bad if it was happening in abstract, but also given the overtones that these places have. It's in Afghanistan, which you can't get kind of in a more contemporary sort of inflammatory place, perhaps, than that in a game. And from what I understand, I haven't played the game, you go around and you can recruit these locals, basically, to do stuff for you, and they kind of don't have very much personality and they just sort of run around doing your bidding. And I believe that the thrust of this piece is that as an attitude, that's not particularly sort of good, really.
Well, it's even worse than that. These are enemy combatants which you knock out with a stun gun or by hitting them in the face, and then attach them to a big balloon which takes it up to a helicopter which takes them to your base, and sometimes they die and sometimes they survive, and then when you're at their base they're automatically without any question, they actually are happy to be recruited by you, and then they wander around your base, and whenever you go and you can improve their stats by going and smacking them in the face, and they always thank you afterwards. So again, I'm really sorry, but my take on this is that it's nothing to do with where this is going on. It's all completely crazy. Like, for me, that is too far away from anything realistic to be able to say this is unacceptable because it's in Afghanistan and it would be better if it was somewhere else. It's just kind of, we can have a conversation about whether or not this is acceptable. It just doesn't feel like it's relevant to where it is to me.
That's a really weird attitude. So you're basically saying that this is so bad that if you add any context to it, it doesn't matter because it's so bad anyway?
I think it's so abstract. Like, I feel like such a huge proportion of this is not like referencing a particular context. It's kind of, just, I don't feel like the concept of going, knocking someone out, attaching them to a balloon, doing all this bizarre stuff, I don't feel like it has, like, I don't feel like any of the first 20 reactions I have to that are sort of specific to a particular culture or a particular place. I think just about them abstractly in terms of them being people on people, I guess.
Right, but isn't that the entire nature of this colonialist attitude that he's attempting to describe here?
What's that?
As in the idea that there's this entire process that you go through with a culture that exists, that you're coming into it and you're just taking it for your own purposes and invading that country. Isn't that kind of...
Right, I guess that is the point, and I guess I'm rejecting that.
Because...
because I think... I don't need a reason to reject it, necessarily. I just think it's like... it functions as a metaphor for a lot of weird things, but, like... I don't know. What's your take on this?
Well, I think this is really stupid. Like, this is the first I've heard about this. I can't believe that someone would make a game with this idea in it now, in these contexts. I think it's appalling. I'd certainly never write a setting like this. I find it absolutely baffling. And I'm kind of surprised it's not been talked about more, because it's so directly relevant to something that's happened throughout history, and he's saying that it's not really very examined in the game. Apparently there's this kind of weird hand-wavy dialogue that explains that the people actually kind of like it and it's okay.
Yeah, that is exactly what happens.
I mean, that's just astonishing to me.
Well, I mean, fair enough. I mean, they take. I mean, they're taken. These people are taken by helicopter to your base, which I think is in the Seychelles. So it's like, you know, isn't that also about kidnapping?
Right, but I mean that would be a big part of this process.
Is that right? Is there a lot of that in
traditionally.
colonialism? You take people to your other countries, etc. I guess.
Well, yeah, I mean slavery and colonialism are very closely related ideas.
Right. I guess I'm just trying to come to terms with the idea that you can have like a concept that's bad like that, but it's worse when it's sort of in a place where it's culturally insensitive, I guess.
I mean, I think the idea is that what he's saying here is that it's almost completely unconscious. It's sort of just, you know, well, why wouldn't you do this? It's kind of the way that you see this as a sort of an idea that is almost surreal. To a lot of people, I don't think they would feel that way. I think they'd see it as this sort of historical kind of assumption that this is okay. I mean, we've seen all the inflammatory stuff about Columbus Day recently as well. That people are very keen to look at this kind of part of history that happens so frequently and think about the way that it certainly, after it's happened, it's then, you know, transfigured into being something else. It just seems very weird that you have the hero of a game going around doing this. Maybe there is a point about how it's just viewed as noble and necessary by almost anyone invading any country and doing anything. That it's maybe that's an innately human idea.
Yeah, I do think it's relatively surreal, but I'm willing to connect with this part of it. I mean, I think my guess would be that this happened because it was a good game mechanic, and we can definitely talk about the appropriateness of that. I mean, I think there's quite a lot of you're turning the enemies into a resource. I think in stealth games there's this massive issue with killing versus knocking out, which is that killing is usually superior because the guy will never wake up, and therefore you have to give players reasons to not kill. And we've seen various different games have different approaches to that. I remember that Dishonored tried to push you in that direction by having like this big thing about if you remember, you know, if you get through the whole game without killing anyone, that's a really big deal, and the number of rats in the city or something reflected how many people you killed. And I was reflecting on this aspect of Metal Gear Solid and how clever it is that it's forcing me, sort of funnily enough, to view the soldiers in a more fleshed out way, because I have to work out whether I want to kill them or not, as opposed to it just being automatic that I would want to kill them. So my kind of suspicion here is that, I mean, honestly, from having played it, I don't get very many metaphorical overtones to it, or allegorical overtones to it, in terms of what the designers were intending. I think it was kind of just sort of taken to a pretty humorous natural conclusion in terms of how surreal it is, of what they found out worked mechanically.
Right, yeah, and so there's a point there about criticism, which a lot of people have been talking about recently, in terms of should you be doing interpretation or not. So this is an interpretive piece of criticism, which is drawing wide implications from it, but then other critics would argue that interpreting something is wrong, and you should just look at kind of what you've done there, which is more of a mechanical view of what is it actually doing. Can we sort of explore that? I have always felt and still feel like that those two things are related. Some people are going to come to this and they're going to see it as you do from a design perspective first, and then they're going to sort of struggle with secondary implications. And other people are going to come to this and say, well, it's a soldier kidnapping, you know, soldiers who are indigenous to a country and forcing them to do work for them. And that's something that, you know, they might think about very readily. So I do feel that it's really interesting. In modern games, though, I think you've got to be a bit more aware than this of those contexts when you make them, certainly, and perhaps deal with it better than just saying, like, oh, it's okay, at one point in the game.
Well, I mean, I find that really challenging, that concept, because the extent to which Metal Gear is willing to override aesthetic concerns for mechanics is one of the things I like most about it, and one of the things that makes it such an interesting game. And I'm kind of torn about this. Is so funny. This is the first time I felt emotional about this subject in terms of what could be being taken away by political correctness. because I don't think it's sort of intentionally offensive, and I think it's kind of a weird thing. I wonder what it would look like if they had to take out this mechanic, and it sort of feels sort of like it's something that it would be missing from the game. But obviously, I also understand, as always, the necessity to not upset people as well. So I'm sort of wrestling with this one.
And it's so interesting that your primary design response is that you might have to take out the mechanic, because of course it's the implications of the mechanic, not the mechanic itself, that are perhaps the problem here.
Can you separate those two things? I mean,
well, that's a big question, isn't it? Like, is there a way of reframing that mechanic in a way that doesn't have these problems? There might be.
So, like, if you, I don't know, send them home, and then, or if they all had a gold dog tag that you could take, and that would allow you to hire someone on the free market. I don't know. Yeah.
Right. And would that be, that would be interesting. Maybe also, I mean, I haven't played the game, so I don't know that there might be some more sophisticated things happening with the idea. So this might be one way of interpreting it, and it's open to, there's ambiguity around it. So
I really don't think there is much more going on. For me, this is a little borderline. A lot of these things, like it's a fun exercise to look at all of these little controversies and decide whether we think it's okay or it's not okay. For me, this is pretty borderline, because again, I think presentation matters, and I think that it is such a bizarre thing that helps it get removed a little bit, but sure, you're always going to have problems when you set things in places like Afghanistan. Like if you set it in Birmingham or something, you're going to have fewer issues, fewer things are going to possibly hit hotspots.
That's very unlikely given the nature of Birmingham. According to Reddit user Griswold is Orange, Cities Skylines saved them from buying a house on a floodplain. In an AMA, they told the developers that it only became apparent after simulating their own town in the game that the house they wanted to buy was actually below the water level and was at severe risk of flooding. They did not elaborate on why simulating town in the game was more important to them than obtaining land registry records. I detect a little bit of snark from producer Jimmy in that. What mishap has a computer game prevented in your life?
I really don't know how to cope with this story. This is absolutely insane. I also don't have a particularly pithy answer to this. Do you have a pithy answer to this?
Sometimes I don't go fast enough, and Sonic the Hedgehog told me that going fast is occasionally useful.
Okay, that's good. I suppose playing computer bridge has helped me avoid making real life bridge mishaps. That's cheating. I love this idea. So this couple, or this guy's a massive Cities Skylines fan. He's so excited about his new house that he actually kind of models it in Cities Skylines, and then he's like, "Why is it actually underwater?" And it's almost kind of a lack of a feature in Cities Skylines which shows him this impending problem. This is really a fairy tale story for me. I really enjoy it. I'm really happy for these guys. Although, what about the people trying to sell the house? They should sue
Right.
Cities Skylines for this.
I know, this is so weird, and it's such an odd. As Jimmy points out, this is the most roundabout way of basically doing one of the most fundamental things you must do if you're buying a house, which is see if it'll get flooded or not. The fact that you get to that from playing Cities Skylines is just such an interesting process. I mean, yeah, what about, is this misrepresenting that area of the city? And I suppose that he simulated the town himself. So then it's very difficult to know who would be responsible in this case. I think probably he would be responsible rather than the developers. But
we need to get the lawyers involved in this. And I'm now just trying to work out what other games that I can simulate aspects of my life in to find out what they say. I mean, I made a GTA 1 level of our school. I remember that, but there weren't any particularly useful results of that. I made a few Shadow Warrior levels based on my home village, and that didn't really help me find any hidden treasure or kill my enemies any better. So, but games are getting more advanced, and maybe I'm sure people are going to start modeling real life prisons in Prison Architect. I'm sure that's happening. Oh
yeah, I'm sure that's happened all the time. Especially now that you can escape from them. You can play a single character and then escape from them, which is very cool. I find this so fascinating. These games that relate so closely to reality that actually make you think about reality in a different way. They're so attractive to people now. But I do wonder about, like, are people relying on this to teach them about life?
I mean, in a lot of ways, this is like only one step up from when you're thinking about having a kitchen extension, designing it in like a kitchen designing piece of software. This is just like taking this to the next logical area. I mean, what he really should have done is modeled the entire road system there and worked out where the traffic hotspots and whether his household's extra 2 cars was going to have an important impact on the traffic ecosystem. So he can go further with this.
We need middle-class simulator that just, like, tells you how far away you are from schools, like, where's the nearest Waitrose, is it loud after 11 on a Friday, that kind of thing.
Where's the nearest farm? Yeah, great. It should be a Sims expansion.
Exactly. Sim middle class. A complete overhaul, in inverted commas, of Deus Ex has just been launched on Steam. The mod includes modified and expanded levels, new music, and a collection of the best community mods for graphics, sound, UI, and more. How do we feel about Redux mods, Ian Hardingham?
Well, I'm going to answer that with a question. I've got a new version of Hamlet for you, Mr. Paul Kilduff-Taylor, and I've added a few extra chapters and changed the font. How do you feel about that?
Well, this happens a lot in the Benedict Cumberbatch version of Hamlet. They took the to be or not to be speech and put it at the beginning! At the beginning! Before the ghost turns up! So, no, I don't like that. I don't think that's a particularly good thing to do. People are always messing around with stuff. This, though, I mean, I'm interested in playing, if it was just a very comprehensive, like, graphical overhaul only, and maybe some sound, then I'd be interested. But I don't want different music, and I'm very dubious of expanded and modified levels, given how great the level design is in Deus Ex. So I feel deeply conflicted about it, but I haven't tried it, and I feel like I should do, because a lot of people are saying that it's very good. And I did look at the trailer, and they had some cool levels in the trailer, so I'm in two minds.
Well, I'm not. I'm pretty sure that I don't want to play this. Do not respect the idea. I'm sure the people involved are very nice, generally nice human beings, but I'm not on board with this. I really, I think we have talked about this before. I do have some time for just graphical updates, although even that just feels like it loses the history for me. Like, I'm really kind of an artifact person. Like, I like seeing this thing, be it a game or a movie or something else. I like thinking about it in terms of the context of how it's released, the context of how it's aged, sort of really being amused and bemused, but what it can show me about what things were like back then that I didn't notice. And I've just basically got no time for this kind of stuff.
I think in the case, I agree. I mean, there's some rare cases where a game is so ugly, in inverted commas, that you can't play it because the graphics are so bad and so old. And I think those games benefit the most from graphical updates where, you know, maybe it doesn't run at the right resolution. That's slightly rhetorically bad there because that becomes about functionality, but maybe it doesn't quite work at the right resolution, or it just looks really bad on a modern monitor, that kind of thing. In those cases, I think graphical updates are really important. But other than that, I'm totally with you. You know, something I was thinking the other day is I really, really want to play Half-Life 1 again, because I feel like that era is still something that's being kind of quite neglected. It was from seeing that game Bedlam, the one that is the, you know, the run-through of FPS history, is the idea. That just made me think, well, I don't want to play that, but maybe I should play Half-Life 1 again. So yes, artifacts, I agree.
Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting sort of side note to this. So, you know, like, you've made a lot of music that I like a lot, and a lot of that came from sort of more than a few years ago. And I spend the majority of my time listening to really modern, very, very, very modernly produced electronic dance music from, like, Gareth Emery's label. And it's always a little difficult making the transition to one of your older tracks because it just feels very different. And it takes me a little while to get into it. You know what I'm talking about. And I kind of feel that the same is probably true of these older games. Like, if you really want to go back and properly enjoy Half-Life 1, I don't know how you would do this, but you probably have to get in the right state for it. You know, like, don't do it directly after having played Rocket League or Metal Gear or something. Like, you might need to play a couple of old Mario games first or something. So, because I think that that's the best way to really enjoy it, just sort of get out of your head what games are like now and sort of go back in time a bit.
Oh, that's definitely true. You need to create some space around. You find this with reading older literature or even watching old movies. The pacing is going to be different for one thing in those forms, and they're obviously because they're linear, they're obviously very pace based. So you have to kind of clear your brain a bit in whatever way you can in order to engage with it properly, and it requires a bit of concentration. Modern stuff is very much designed to appeal to how people's brains are now and the level of things we're exposed to now, but older stuff isn't. It was about that time, so there is some effort involved, and I don't know if I think these reduxes, they don't overcome that problem. They actually end up creating something else, which is weirder, that is kind of harder to process because you're thinking about the relationship between the new stuff and the old stuff a lot.
Yeah, the HD sort of re-releases, I can get behind that because a lot of money is being spent, a lot of talent is being spent to actually make the game look modern. So that's fine with me, and I think those are actually quite good, those things in general, as long as they're executed well. But I mean, I'm sorry to be really snooty, but I don't really want a bunch of modders doing what they think needs to be done to Deus Ex. Like, I'd like to play their own original game. Maybe it would be influenced by Deus Ex, but this particular thing is not up my alley.
Blizzard have nerfed the Warsong Commander card in Hearthstone, which stops warriors doing ludicrous combos with minion spawning cards like the Grim Patron. Players have called this nerf heavy-handed. How do you know when it's the right time to nerf something like this?
Well, you generally know because it's the deck that uses whatever the mechanic is by far the most dominant amongst online proper professional players. And I think that's actually pretty clear to see when that happens. They can look at the data, etc. I have some great commentary on this from Visiting the Village Magic the Gathering correspondent Tom Richards. So I want to very quickly explain how this combo works for people who can understand these things. Basically, Warsong Commander allows newly created minions, which are Hearthstone's version of creatures, to attack the same turn as they come in, i.e. it gets rid of their summoning sickness. And then this card, Grim Patron, has the effect text, whenever this minion survives damage, summon another Grim Patron. So it probably doesn't take a massive math genius to understand that the combination, the new Grim Patron that he summons after suffering damage, is then given the ability to attack immediately, is then given the ability to suffer damage himself, and you can see a long chain being produced. Now, if this was Magic the Gathering, this would be a completely obvious combo deck, because in Magic the Gathering, you could have one creature that was, say, attack 1, defense 4, and the first Grim Patron could attack it and take damage and summon the next one, and then he'd attack it, and it could go on for literally forever. But because in Hearthstone, you lose health when you get attacked, where a creature loses health, whereas that's basically not true in Magic. In Magic, your creature only dies if he takes more or the same amount of damage as his defense. So it's kind of not as overwhelming. But yeah, the great message I got from Tom when I asked him about this is that they nerfed the wrong card. He said that Warsong Commander itself is a pretty uninteresting card, and he expects another deck to come along in the future which uses Grim Patron to also produce a bad combo. Whenever you have a card that can replicate itself, he says, in the history of card games, that's the kind of thing that gets you in trouble all of the time, whereas a card like Warsong Commander is just usually only an enabler in itself and isn't really that exciting. So Paul Kilduff-Taylor, they nerfed the wrong card.
That makes a lot of sense to me, actually. I agree with that. The effect of replicating itself is, if you think about that historically in computer science and culture, that's a pretty powerful effect. So making a card
in almost any context, that's overpowered.
Exactly. It's something that could replicate itself. Especially in Hearthstone, where stuff can stick around for a long time. I didn't actually know that about Magic, that they have to be damaged more than their defense stat. I mean, that must produce some pretty interesting situations.
Yeah, it's a really fundamental change. Sorry, just to pivot onto that very quickly. It's really one of the top 3 most fundamental changes in Hearthstone from Magic, and I think it produces a game which is a bit less mathematically hardcore than Magic, because the thing about needing to do all of the damage at once to kill a creature, which is somewhat what's going on here, it kind of makes it much more of a state-based game in a lot of ways. And I think it makes it basically, it adds more maths. I'm not saying that Hearthstone doesn't have plenty of maths itself, but you know what I mean.
Right, I think it basically makes it harder to do semi-okay stuff. Because in Hearthstone, if you can damage certainly a minion that has, a lot of health without doing anything dumb, like trading a really important card or, missing a really important opportunity. If you can generally do some damage to cards in your turn, then that's okay. Like, you can get away with that. You won't just lose the game because you did the wrong thing at a low and medium level. So I think that definitely, I think it's right. I think it makes it less mathematically hardcore because even if you do the wrong play, it won't be as bad.
Yeah, I totally agree with that.
Yeah. This is really interesting. I didn't realise that the Hearthstone meta was kind of this refined. The Hearthstone meta still swings around very strongly. It's one of the things that puts me off quite a lot. It still doesn't really seem to have stabilised that much in terms of it clusters around these massively overpowered things and then it swings onto the next overpowered thing. And that to me is quite an early stage game thing. But then I guess Hearthstone is a relatively young game, certainly compared to either StarCraft or Magic. So that's going to be what happens, I suppose.
I suppose so, although given that Magic introduces a new set every 3 months and that has obviously a massive metagame impact, in some ways you could say that Magic might have a bit longer metagame in some ways. I understand that's a bit of a simplification. But yeah, I don't really pay much attention to Hearthstone, so I don't really know what the distribution of decks at the top level is.
Relevant to our earlier discussion, 3D roguelike Sublevel Zero launched recently. The game is similar to Descent, aside from the random generation of its levels. The main problem seems to be a lack of interest in said levels. What is going to change this for 3D games?
Yeah, I've been trying to work this out. As I said, I've played a couple of games, and I've been just generally that have 3D generated levels, and I've generally been really, really uninterested in them. And I feel like I don't understand this interplay with the architecture and the gameplay in 3D sort of first person games very well. I mean, I guess people are just going to have to keep talking to level designers, going to have to keep working out what's going on. I mean, it sort of brings into mind, it's got to be a great first-person shooter to start with, like the gun mechanics, that kind of thing. It has to be really good for a game to be really good, and in some ways you have to do that first before you can work out what the architecture even needs to be. But I'd certainly like to read an article by a great, Counter-Strike level designer or something talking about this issue.
Yeah, I think something we discussed before is that it's hard to make discrete units in FPS levels, so Spelunky works well because it can plug together those sort of interesting level components. But if you think about doing that in an FPS, that would just kind of be a bit weird because it's so much about which sequence follows directly on from the previous sequence. So even if you had, say, 2 good rooms with corridor attachments that have interesting monsters in them, as soon as you put those two things together, that may or may not be good level design. It would be very... You'd have to get into a very strict set of rules about combinations that might just bloom out into too many permutations too quickly, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, a room-based approach to this, and I understand, of course, why that's the first thing you would do, is going to produce... That's going to be a little bit substandard, even if the rooms themselves can be very large. I mean, I think everyone agrees that one of the nicest things about first-person shooter levels is when they can show you things that you've just done or foreshadow things that you're about to do, show you the rooftop that you're about to scale in 5 minutes time, that kind of thing. I think that's a really important part of the subconscious goodness of these levels. I mean, if I were sort of designing a system for this, I guess I'd want to, like, if it was a multiplayer level generator, which is kind of a different matter, the base unit would be the flow, because everyone who plays games like Quake and Unreal Tournament, they talk about how basically they run around in little circles, little paths, which is how they play the game. They're trying to hit all of the power-ups, and they're trying to get some coverage, and they're trying to see where and trying to have a good route that always keeps them moving and gives them good. They're more likely to see their opponent in a good position than they are likely to be ambushed. So if I was creating a generator something like that, I'd want to produce the shape of those flows first, and then kind of fill in the architecture around them. I mean, for a single player game, I mean, I'm thinking about my favorite first person shooters. I mean, something like Far Cry. It's still about linear vignettes. I mean, a lot of them have very big spaces. I'm kind of blanking on this. It's something that I would have to spend a lot of time thinking about.
I think one of the key problems in single player is that its levels are narrative in their nature. So things like, there's great Thief levels where, like the one with the massive crypt, where you go into the kind of underground catacomb, and then there's the sort of weird organic cave bit underneath this house, and everything, all of that is about narrative and contrast and some of the implications of the space. I mean, you even mentioned narrative techniques like foreshadowing. You're not going to be able to do that generatively yet because well, you could potentially do that, but you'd have to establish some really strict rules again for how that would work. And I just think that's not the kind of thinking that people will apply to random generation, because they want something that will make the level for them. They don't want to have to think about those ideas.
Yeah, I mean, you're right to talk about the rules. That's kind of what it comes down to. You can't create one of these systems without a bunch of rules. When I think about what was the old game by the people who made Metropolis Street Racer, they made this kind of first-person shooter game that was they tried to make it a bit like a racing game. I think it was called The Club. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now that's a game where I think random generated levels would work much better, because it's just about the game. I mean, it's like the challenge there is very clear. It's about getting combos, about doing things fast. You can much easier see how you would be producing the generator to make interesting challenges, which is really what people have to be clear on. And I bet that if I was to play Sub-Level 0, you'd see that they hadn't actually thought, and I'm deeply sorry if this is far too patronising, but hadn't really thought about what the meta play of each of these levels would be like. I mean, I played a lot of Descent. I really liked Descent. I also was a huge fan of Forsaken, which was a great multiplayer game, another sort of Descent type game from a bit later on. And when I think about how these massive 6 degrees of freedom levels work, there are some tricks that you really have to codify. So I think I think the problem that I'm having here is that I'm assuming that all generative content is created equal, and just because 2D generated content is quite mature now, that 3D will be as well, and that's definitely wrong. I just think this is kind of an immature field.
Yeah, you're probably right there. And I'm so interested in your call that there will be a big generated FPS soon. I think you're right. Like, I really think that someone... there are so many great minds in indie games. That's why it's one of the best places to work. There are people out there who will take that on as a problem and dedicate their time to it and come up with something really interesting. So that is really exciting. And the narrative stuff with generative content is something that really interests me. There are a few people working on things at the moment that I've seen which do attempt to address that, and I don't think it's insurmountable, especially given how rigid a lot of certainly plot stuff is. So all of these innovations together could happen, and we could get some really interesting stuff in the future.
Let's hope so.
According to Rocket News 24, a person in Japan has kept their SNES turned on for over 20 years in an effort to keep their save file for the game Umehara Kawaii. By keeping it turned on, they don't need to worry about the battery in the cartridge dying. Ian Hardingham, is this hardcore gaming?
Yes, it is. I'm going to assume this guy isn't married. I'm not sure I'd be allowed to get away with anything as exciting as this. Although, this seems like a cool world record to have that'd be relatively easy to do. So I'm just going to get out an old NES or something. I'm just going to plug it in up in my attic. I'm just going to leave it on. Maybe in one of these fireproof bags you can get, like just in case it bursts into flames. This is cool. It's always fun to hear crazy things people do, and it's also always fun to hear about the little batteries that are inside these cartridges, which just the concept of which really excites me. I remember back when we were looking at doing Nintendo DS games, and we looked at the cost of buying cartridges. And how much more it costs to have these little batteries inside. I mean, in some ways, I can't believe it was as recent ago as 2009 or whatever that this was still a thing that you did, have a little battery inside a cartridge. This is cool. Really, good on this guy.
Yes, well done, this guy. Yeah, that's true. Like these sort of save techniques. There's so many games used those ridiculous passwords on the 16-bit consoles that were like 40 characters long, and I always was amazed that like if you decided to go for a password system, that your password system was that bad that it needed all of that stuff. Yeah, and the batteries. There's so many of these cartridges now with dead batteries. I think some people are able to replace them, so you can get new versions of like your Shining in the Darkness cartridge with its battery in. I mean, this is such a weird record, but people do keep finding other weird stuff to do with games. Yeah, I go and look at this on Rocket News 24. He's got a picture of the Vita version of the game next to the SNES version of the game, which is sort of oddly poetic. That's about it, really. Andy Mason has compiled a rock representation retrospective for the Game Jar as part of an ongoing series about wrestling games. In it, he rates a number of games for their verisimilitude. When it comes to Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, Ian Hardingham, how important is an accurate representation of The Rock to game culture?
I think it's it can be high quality without being all that accurate. I'm very sorry that I can't show you listeners all of these pictures, but I found this both sort of semi amusing. Look at all the funny pictures of The Rock in games over the last 15 years, but also kind of really, really interesting. Like if you'd asked me to come up with the person that had been represented in most different video games, I probably would have had to choose like a soccer player or something. But something about pro wrestling means that they actually kind of stick around longer generally. And Mario as well, but he's not a real person. And some of these pictures of The Rock really are absolutely terrifyingly terrible. Yes. But it's just really cool to see how gaming has evolved.
I think that's true. Wrestling games are such a perennial thing, and they seem to never go away. There's something about wrestling that's very tied into game culture, and this really is a great tour through some of the best and worst graphical styles of the last sort of 15 years or so.
I mean, I'm looking at the first picture here, which is from WrestleMania 2K15 or something, and it looks frankly photorealistic. Like, I'm getting quite excited just looking at The Rock's face in this picture. And then some of these, there's like a really stylized one that looks like a bit like the Batman cartoon. And then there's just like whatever you call the graphics from the N64 and like a lot of stuff like that. So,
yeah. And 2011 when everything was really shiny. Yeah. So a really shiny version of The Rock there.
Where's like full screen SSAO Rock? That's what we need to see. Bloom Rock.
The one in 2000 here, it looks like someone's just pasted a 2D image of The Rock's face onto a completely flat surface on a 3D model.
It really does.
That's how they did the face. That needs to make a comeback. That's the best way of doing faces I've ever seen. And then there's this, below that is, you should definitely go and look at this on the Game Jar. That's enough of The Rock. And now it's time for Ian's Magic Corner, where Ian talks about Magic the Gathering. Take it away, Ian.
So last week, we talked about the possibility that Magic Duels, the new platform from Wizards of the Coast, was possibly doing badly, based on some data from our correspondent. Mm-hmm. And we looked to the numbers. We looked to Steam Spy, and apparently, according to Steam Spy, Magic Duels has had 120,000 unique players in the last 2 weeks.
Okay.
Which seems quite good, I suppose, although it is a free-to-play game.
Yeah.
He seems to think on this site that there are 900,000 people who, in inverted commas, own Magic Duels, which I'm sure means that they've downloaded it, again, because it's free-to-play. And I was kind of, when I first saw it, I was like, oh, okay, I've got this wrong. It's obviously sort of very, very popular. And then I kind of thought about it a little more, and I realised that I had no idea what the context for free-to-play game success is on Steam, because if it's free-to-play and lots of people are just loading it up to see what it's like, maybe 120,000 people in the last 2 weeks isn't very much.
Yeah.
So I asked you for a couple of mid-range free-to-play games, and you said Robocraft, which people seem to like a lot. That's had 326,000 players in the last 2 weeks, and that's got many more owners. That's got 10 times as many owners. That's got 8.5 million owners.
Oh, okay.
So my brain died while trying to work out if that meant anything. And then Transform Ice
Yes.
has more owners, 1.2 million owners, more owners than Magic Jewels, but significantly less players in the last 2 weeks, only 51,000. Okay. So I guess that just means it came out a little earlier. So I'm lost here. I know I'm the stats guy, but you help me out.
This seems to be like not a very successful free-to-play game. Like at the scale that they would want to do it, 100,000 odd unique users in a week is not good. Like
2 weeks.
If you in 2 weeks, yeah, okay, well, it's definitely not good compared to, for example, what you might want from a semi-successful iOS free-to-play game. If you were really serious about it. Because it's Wizards, though, we don't know what they were aiming for. We don't know if they were using traditional FTP games as the metric, or if they just wanted this to be some weird adjunct to whatever the other thing is called, Magic Online. So I think that this generating a fan response that it's a failure is completely consistent for me, actually. That's the kind of thing where it could well be fine, and it could well be doing quite well if they didn't expect it to be Clash of Clans. But fans will be like, no, it's not on any of the top charts. It's not doing this. It's not doing that.
Yeah, it's also got a very low user score of 46%, which is pretty bad. They had a very bad first couple of months. So I think they'll probably get there with this. I mean, they've got to work this out eventually. But it sounds like it's not a very successful first 6 months.
Yeah, and if you had that, of course, coupled with a very bad conversion rate internally, I mean, that's the key stat for a lot of these games, especially the mid-range one. If you don't have that many players on the input side, you need to have a good conversion rate. So if it's not popular and people don't enjoy it and they have conversion problems, then it could also be problematic. Again, free-to-play is so annoying to speculate about because a few stats here would just absolutely give us the answer. But yeah.
Yeah.
That's the end of Ian's Magic Corner, and now we're going to quickly turn to Paul's Smash Corner, and I'm going to talk about planking, which is something I encountered recently. Now, it's not the annoying Facebook trend. Planking is a technique in Smash Brothers where you grab the ledge, and then you let go of the ledge and re-grab it again quickly. In all of the games, you get some invincibility frames when you grab the ledge. In some of them, you don't get invincibility frames the second time you grab the ledge, and the invincibility time lasts a variable amount in different games. So I came across this because I played a Kirby player in Smash 4 who kept planking and then just popping up above the ledge, doing an attack and dropping down, and they never did anything else. And I found that pretty hard to deal with. So I talked to a few people online, and they said one of the things that you have to do is you have to go in and contest them grabbing the ledge and then hit them in the air as they drop down. Now, that I'm not a good Smash Brothers player, that's quite hard to do, and it's quite risky because you can fall off the ledge and die. So at a low level, I'm sure this guy has been online planking away merrily with his stupid Kirby for ages, because you can beat a lot of low level players with that. There's another way you can deal with it, which is very high risk, where you do a down air attack, and for most characters that means that you will also die, so you have to make sure they die before you have to hit them properly. If you do the down air during their invincibility frames, you will just go through them and die yourself, so that's bad. Now, in Smash Brothers Brawl, planking was a really big problem with Meta Knight. It was actually overpowered, and a lot of people weren't able to deal with it at all. But then a player came up with an advanced technique called anti-planking, which involves using the shield stun, which we talked about last week, to block the player as they pop up above the stage, block their attack, and then simultaneously push themselves off the stage so they could follow up during the lag frames from the planking player's attack. So in Brawl, it needed to be a specific counter to this. In Smash 4, some of the design changes they made basically means that planking isn't a viable strategy at a high level, so it's a bit less annoying for new players. But I was really interested in this as an example of a low-level exploit in a game, which needs to be countered by sort of decent mid-level play. You have to be quite good to be able to grab the ledge and time back air. So it's one of the first things you have to learn. And I think things like this really show how you can get interesting problems in this type of game, but also they can be created by players basically trolling and doing annoying gameplay. So there you go. That's my treatise on planking.
Well, I thoroughly enjoyed that. Thank you for explaining planking and contesting planking to me.
There you go.
I love this world we live in. Yeah, it's really bad when you have just any kind of thing which a mid-level player can do that's like that's just incredibly hard to intuitively counter by a new player. And it's sort of, I think it kind of in some ways it sounds a tiny bit like the distraction play in Frozen Synapse.
Yes.
The kind of thing that will be eradicated in some way soon, I promise. Yeah, I mean, you just got to fix it. It's as simple as that. This is the kind of thing, this is much worse to me than sort of having like an overpowered pro deck or something like that. This is something that's really impacting people getting into the game to start with. So they've got to sort it out.
The changes they made for Smash 4 were really intended to do that, and as everyone sort of said to me, like, you know, oh, in that game it's fine and you just have to do this back air thing, and that's something that at my level, if I practice that for an hour, I can probably learn to consistently beat people, and that's okay. So on some level it's sort of this interesting microcosm of how the game can be about these weird tactics and knowing how to counter them, but also, yeah, it is incredibly annoying to play against, and Kirby generally as a character is so bad because he can duck under almost any attack. So a lot of these planking people, they alternate between duck camping and just staying ducked the whole time and doing low attacks and then doing this planking thing just to be maximally annoying. So
yeah,
yes,
Kirby was annoying in the only Smash Brothers game I played very much of, which is the first one. He was a real knob in that as well.
Luckily, in general, he's a shit tier character, so he doesn't get that much use, apart from annoying people. Right, time to discuss games that were released this week in 2005, thanks to Eurogamer for providing the information, and we'll start off with Blitzkrieg 2 on the PC. Not particularly notable, but I think we're coming out of the terrible period of World War II stuff that in 2005 that then kind of made a big resurgence later on. Bratz Rock Angels on the PS2, GameCube, PC and GBA. Now there's a franchise that I'm glad has died. Driver on the GBA. I mean, really?
Sorry, this is Driver 3 or DRIV3R, just to be clear. Yeah, I actually heard of that. Something I think I mildly wanted to get, but never did.
That must have been like a really late stage GBA kind of... Because we had the rise of the DS last week on the show, so actually porting Driver 3 to the GBA must have been quite the effort at that point.
Yeah, I think it's around now that the Metal Gear Solid game came out on the GBA, which was supposedly quite good, although I wasn't overly convinced myself.
Marvel Nemesis Rise of the Imperfects, what a terrible name that is, on the Xbox, PS2 and GameCube. Midway Arcade Treasures 3, they just won't stop, on the PS2, GameCube and PC. Serious Sam 2 on the Xbox and PC. Serious Sam 2 was pretty good, I believe.
Yeah, I had Serious Sam 2. I was never like a super fan of this series, but I certainly bought it and enjoyed it.
Spy Toy on the PS2, which is a really weird iToy minigame collection thing. Stuart Little 3 on the PS2. They made Stuart Little sequels? Was there a Stuart Little 3 movie? Oh, I guess there was a Stuart Little 3 movie. Tato Legends on the Xbox, PS2 and PC. Ultimate Spider-Man on the Xbox, PS2, GameCube, PC, DS and GBA. Was Ultimate Spider-Man the one that had the cool swinging mechanics, or was that another Spider-Man later on?
That's possible, but you've kind of taken me by surprise asking me about my Spider-Man game lore. I don't have that knowledge at my fingertips.
There was one that had really cool mechanics, and Jamie Fristrom made an indie game that had the similar mechanics in recently that did not do very well, but was still very interesting.
This could be it. This could be it.
It could be it. Wallace and Gromit: The Curse of the Were-Rabbit, which is a terrible movie, actually, Xbox on PS2. X-Men Legends 2 Rise of Apocalypse, Xbox, PS2, GameCube, PC, and PSP. And for some reason, Jimmy has sneaked in on the 18th of October 2005, Fear on the PC. Fear was quite well regarded, I remember.
Yeah, Fear was really good, actually. I didn't really get on with it because it's all supernaturally. And it's all about kind of like a bit of ghost stories along with the shooting. And the shooting was great, but I'm just not that into like ghost children floating through walls, or I certainly wasn't at the time. I'm kind of slightly more up with that now. But the shooting was really, really cool. I remember it was the first game that had this really great animation of the AI soldiers like sort of vaulting over edges onto different platforms that made it look really, really modern. But yeah, I think it was really successful and people liked it.
Marvellous. And now we catapult ourselves into the present day with the top 10 UK Steam games. It's not a very interesting week this week, so we'll rattle through. Number 10 is Ark Survival Evolved. Number 9 is Sid Meier's Civilization Beyond Earth Rising Tide. I've heard not good things about this. You're not particularly keen on the Beyond Earth, are you?
No, I'm afraid not. I'm a massive Alpha Centauri hipster, and I've got no time for this glorified Civilization 6 mod.
Far Cry 4, 33% off. Number 8. Number 7 is Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag, 66% off.
I like Black Flag.
You did.
I liked it on the PlayStation 4. I liked that game quite a lot.
Number 6 is Tales of Zestiria, which is another one of these anime RPG things which is just dominating. They come into the top 10 for 2 weeks. They sit around. It is just a cash cow for someone out there. Number 5 is Fallout 4. Number 4 is Minecraft Story Mode, which is doing very well for Telltale, a game that people said was a stupid premise, and I never understood why they thought it was a stupid premise. It's just a thing that exists that you could put a story on, and Telltale are good at that. So...
Well, I have to defend the other people here. I can see both your and the rest of humanity's points on this. I think you have to be on board with, Telltale are going to take any IP and make their genre of game in it, and I kind of agree with you that there's nothing particularly more or less stupid about Minecraft doing that than anything else. But I can kind of see just sort of looking at that generally and going and looking a bit askance at it.
Well, yes. Number 3 is Grand Theft Auto 5. Number 2 is Counter-Strike Global Offensive. Number 1 is Rocket League Revenge of the Battle Cars DLC pack. And of course the question is, do they have different hitboxes? Now, that's enough of that. On to your questions. And Andrew Roper says, again, who would win in a poetry slam between you and Ian? And the answer, I think, is still you.
Is this in flux? I mean, do we have to get the reading on this every week? I mean...
So there was some controversy over whether or not we answered it, and we definitely did.
We definitely did.
Insists that we didn't, so we're answering it again. I think you said you'd win with your poetry suplex.
Did I?
Apparently. So, that's the answer has not changed, and further interrogation will yield the same answer. He also says, who could chop down a tree faster with a herring out of me and you?
This is clearly me, because I'd get Robin to do it before you could, right, and then go to the pub.
Would you use a regular herring?
I'd use a green herring. I don't know.
A green or a herring-shaped tree-cutting implement, which would technically not be a herring.
Yeah, that sounds illegal.
I don't know, man.
Under the rules of this game.
Now we've got the response from Dave Coleman, aka Cheshire, who writes us a response every week, and he talks about strategy game stagnation. He says, what about a strategy game where the balance is inherently cyclic, yet random, within certain boundary conditions? That sort of feels like Synapse and Cortex, frankly. Well, I'm not sure that feels like Synapse and Cortex to me. It also seems like something that would be incredibly hard to manage. But again, we made the comparison of what Wizards do with releasing these expansions all the time. And I think that could work. I still want to see a strategy game with regular balance updates that are kind of, intentional.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to this. I guess the core of what he's saying is you don't have to make all of this new content all the time because it's kind of cyclical. But I guess people would be a bit bored by that, and developers always want to put new stuff in.
So about our conversation on white label developers who don't get credited, he makes the point that it really depends which parts of the game they're working on. I think it's an interesting point. He says, I don't think any of the players would greatly care about who implemented the data storage, as long as the critical talent spent their time on the content itself. That's very true, actually. When you're thinking about authorial control, outsourcing to these companies, as long as they don't do anything that affects the things that players care about, then that's kind of the important thing there.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
Humble Bundle subscriptions. He says, I don't have time for all the games I have in my library already. I think that's going to be one of the major criticisms of this. He says the curation aspect brings some value, and that was the thing that we really wanted to see was how it would be curated. Skipping through, he says he should play Rocket League, and we've got to agree with that, Dave. You've got to play Rocket League. Everyone should play Rocket League. He's also horrified by the live audience in Rock Band, and specifically the microtransaction program. So there we go. He says Child of Light looks cute. Thank you, Dave. We're going to move on to his questions for us, which are: how often do you prototype small portions of your ideas to see if they carry any value, or do you only pursue games that you've verbally iterated to the point where you have a full vision?
Well, neither really. We don't do small prototyping runs. That's just kind of not how things have gone, really, for us. And we talk about things a lot verbally. But we don't get like a full design document. I mean, this is something that we're still evolving, really, I guess.
Yeah, I think you tend to now sort of iterate in kind of a modular way. So you build up the main structure of something quite fully, and then you test little bits to see if they're working as you add them in, which seems quite healthy to me.
Yeah. Excuse me for yawning on the podcast. Yes. Yeah, a lot of people do this kind of like micro game jam stuff to come up with ideas. And that's really kind of a million miles away from how I work. Like, I spend a lot of time towards the end of the whatever project I'm working on thinking about the next project. I spend a lot of time just designing it in my head and going through ideas and talking to you about them. And then I kind of want to throw everything into it. I want to commit to doing it and start doing it and just throw absolutely everything into it and do it properly. And that's for me. I've never really game jammed at all. I kind of only want to work on things that can be great, and that requires a lot of time.
There we go. Well, you need to get out of here. I need to get out of here, and the listeners also presumably need to get out of here. So thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks for listening, guys. Bye.
Bye. You can follow me on Twitter at Mode7Games and him at Ian Hardingham. That's the end.
That's it, children. Time for bed. Don't forget to pay us a visit at www.visitingthevillage.com.